Hello, everyone. My name is Kavya Pandey, and I'm a Doctoral Fellow with Center for Wildlife Study. Happy Women's Day to all of you, and thank you for joining us. As we celebrate International Women's Day, it's an honor to spotlight the remarkable contributions of women in conservation. Today, we embark on a journey of two distinguished leaders in the conservation field. Their dedication and passion for wildlife have not only shaped their careers, but have also paved the way for myriad conservation efforts. As the topic is very close to my heart, I'm excited to guide you through this captivating discussion. And our esteemed panelists will share their insights, offering a unique perspective on the intersection of gender and conservation. So without further ado, let's begin our exploration of women in the wild with Dr. Sejal Worah, who is a seasoned leader in natural resource management and sustainable development with 25 years of experience. As the program director of WWF-India, she oversees a team of more than 250 professionals and addressing diverse environmental challenges. Dr. Worah's expertise spans human-wildlife conflict, renewable energy, river pollution, indigenous rights, and coral reef conservation. She is passionate about exploring the intersection of sustainable livelihoods, conservation, and development in the context of India's growing economy and climate change. With a rich international background across 20 countries, Dr. Worah is actively involved with international organizations and governmental committees, making her a prominent figure in environmental advocacy. Thank you, Dr. Worah, for joining us, and we welcome you to CWS Wildlife Chronicles series. You can unmute yourself.
Thanks. After all these years, I still haven't remembered how to unmute myself. Thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me. Look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Next, we have Dr. Jennifer Solomon, who is an associate professor at Colorado State University's Department of Human Dimensions of Natural Resources. It's in a focus on biodiversity conservation. Dr. Solomon's work spans continents, evaluating species projects in Latin America and East Africa. Additionally, she leads pioneering research on the human dimensions of lionfish invasion and women in conservation leadership. With a background in environmental policy and PhD in wildlife ecology, she's dedicated to inspiring future leaders through her teaching and overseas field programs. Thank you, Dr. Solomon. We welcome you to CWS Wildlife Chronicle series.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I would like to share our structure. We'll have 1 hour for the session, and 45 minutes we'll have our discussion, and the remaining 10 to 15 minutes, we can have some questions from the audience, and the audience can put them in the chat box. In the later part of the webinar, we can have some discussions on them. So I would like to start the session by asking a question that I'm sure has been asked to you a lot already, maybe a lot today. So starting with you, Dr. Solomon, I would like to ask you that as a woman in conservation, what personal experiences or inspiration led you to choose your career in wildlife?
Thanks so much. I would like to acknowledge the land I'm on today. It's the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and the Ute nations and peoples. This was like a site of trade and gathering and healing for numerous other Native tribes. And we recognize the peoples as original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it. So thank you so much for having me here today. I grew up in a small farming town in upstate New York, and my mother was a wildlife rehabilitator. So I spent a lot of my childhood surrounded by wildlife. We had raccoons climbing all over us. I would be feeding them. We had kingfisher birds, which are just these gorgeous birds. We'd be feeding them worms. And we had lots of squirrels as well. So lots of wildlife in my life constantly. When I was growing up, one of my really dear friends was the youngest wildlife rehabilitator in the state at the time. And so I got to know animals as individuals rather than animals to manage. And I think that's something that really impressed upon me, the importance of wildlife conservation. Then when I was 17, I had this fantastic opportunity to go to Brazil for a year. I lived with a family in a rural part of the country. I got an opportunity to go to the Amazon. I saw lots of wildlife, But I also saw a lot of development occurring as well. For example, on oil rigs and such. And so, I got to listen to a lot of people talking about the choices they and the country were making. I also then later on in my career went on to do the Peace Corps in Nicaragua and Central America. And then again, I was working with people. I worked for a conservation organization there. And so all of this made me realize that conservation is not really about managing wildlife, but about managing people. And that led me to study policy and then get a PhD in wildlife ecology with a concentration in tropical conservation and development and human dimensions of natural resources, which focuses on how people's values and their knowledge and their behaviors influence and are affected by decisions about the conservation of wildlife and management of natural resources.
Wow, you had such an amazing childhood.
It was pretty great.
Thanks. Dr. Worah, I would want to ask you the same. How do you think the personal experiences and inspiration led you to choose your career in wildlife?
Yeah, so interesting. As you said, people have asked me this question many times. And I started my career in wildlife more than 35 years ago when in India, very few women were actually, in fact, women didn't even know that this was a career. Neither did I, frankly, at that point in time. I had no idea what I was heading for. All I knew growing up, so Jen, I had a very different background from yours growing up. I grew up in a big city. So I grew up in Mumbai. And while wildlife, you might think that wildlife is scarce in Mumbai, I grew up on the edge of the sea and spent my entire childhood exploring the rocky shores outside my home, where I discovered marine life. And I almost became a marine biologist as a result of that, but I didn't. That's a long story. But so the thing is, nature is around you if you search for it. Even in the middle of a very big city. So we had this interest, and my father actually was very interested in the outdoors. So he made it a point that every weekend we went out hiking or trekking or, to a river or to the ocean. So from my childhood, I was exposed to the outdoors. And all I knew growing up, was that I wanted a career and I wanted a job which kept me outdoors. That's all I knew. Nothing beyond that. I didn't know anything about wildlife studies. I didn't know anything about ecology. I just knew that I wanted to be outside and I wanted a job that kept me outside. So anyway, here we go. And at that point in time, when I started my bachelor's in India, my Bachelor of Science, it was the only subject at that time, and it was a completely new subject in India. It was called Life Sciences. And Life Sciences actually offered ecology as an elective. And I saw that and I jumped on it. And I said, okay, here's finally something that links to my liking. And so I took Life Sciences because I saw the word ecology in it. Anyway, so I graduated with a bachelor's degree in life sciences. And then I was like, okay, now what do I do? Frankly, so at that time in India, there was nowhere to study wildlife. There was no Wildlife Institute of India. There was nothing. There was absolutely no knowledge even that you could actually study wildlife. I mean, that was new to me. So I started thinking what to do. And then somebody told me, I can't remember who it was. And I asked that person, whoever it was, who said, why don't you look at the US library? And there are universities in the US which offer degrees in wildlife science. And I was like, no, I don't believe that. How is that possible? So, and then I went to the USIS, the famous libraries, looked at all the university, brochures and the catalogs. And lo and behold, there were tens of God knows how many universities in the US offering wildlife studies. And I was just blown away. I was like, oh my God, there's a whole world out there, which I was not even aware of. So I then applied to universities in the US to study wildlife. I was, I didn't think I would get in. It was just a long shot. Well, surprisingly, I got in and I studied wildlife biology. I did a master's in wildlife biology in Syracuse at the Environmental Science and Forestry College in Syracuse, which, and I have to give you this anecdote from my very first day when I landed there and my first class. So my first class was Wildlife 101. And it was a huge classroom full of maybe about 150 odd students because, everybody. So there were 150 students there. There was a professor. I was pretty much, in heaven thinking, my God, 150 students, all studying wildlife biology, all passionate about wildlife like I am. And I was absolutely in heaven. I couldn't believe where I was. I had never imagined that I would be in a situation where I would study wildlife biology. I would be in a classroom full of students like me, all obsessed with wildlife. Anyway, so then the very first question the professor asked the class was, how many of you hunt? And I just thought, what a stupid question. Why would anybody in this classroom hunt? We're all wildlife lovers. We're here because we want to conserve wildlife. Why is he asking something like that? And then I looked around and I saw that 60% of the class had raised their hand. They were all hunters. They all hunted. And it was such an eye-opener for me to realize that conservation and wildlife biology and wildlife ecology has such different roots in different countries. And in many ways in the US, it was the hunters who went out, who were interested, who were in the open, and who also saw conservation and wildlife as a career. So wake-up call for me to say, don't be so sanctimonious and don't be so narrow-minded about where wildlife conservation comes from. There's a whole world out there, and there are different people studying this for different reasons. So anyway, I went on, I did my master's, I left the US, I came back to India. I worked for a while in India, and then I got restless again and went off to do my PhD. I'll talk a little bit more about my experiences there as we go on with the class. But just to say that my entry into wildlife was serendipitous. If I hadn't discovered all these courses in the US, I don't know what I would be doing. I would have probably studied zoology and God knows what. Got really bored. But anyway, here we are. Thanks.
Yes, it's an incredible journey. I think we are lucky enough that we live in a world now that we have so many courses in wildlife and ecology. So yeah, it's easier now for us to step in directly into the courses if we are interested in wildlife.
Can I just jump in to say something, share something? It's funny that you say that because I teach now in a Human Dimensions program, but every year we ask how many hunters do we have in our class, and out of a class of 100, we'd have like just a handful at most. So it's really shifted a lot over time.
I'm talking 30 years ago, right? 35 years.
Yes.
It's so amazing to hear this. So, Dr. Worah, could you share some of the, your perceptions on the impacts of women's role in, since we're talking about Women's Day and women in the wild, women's role on wildlife conservation and community involvement, and especially within a male-dominated world we see when we talk about wildlife and biodiversity and forest.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I get asked that a lot, about the perception of women in conservation and how has that changed. Is it different because you're a woman? Would it have been different otherwise? And I do believe that because, while I started my career very much a wildlife passionate person, and my initial research also was on wild species, I very quickly, when I went to the field, and I did my field work in India in the Dance district, which is a tribal indigenous people dominated district, where I was looking at, I started off by looking for a very elusive lesser cat. But very quickly, my entire perception shifted and my entire focus in conservation, including what I studied, what I taught, and what my career became community-based conservation. And again, to say that at that point in time, 35 years ago, this was not a term that was used a lot. It was the initial days of community-based conservation. It was the initial days of participatory resource management. And I very much was a strong member of that early movement of community-based conservation. And I believe the reason for it is because the minute I stepped into the wild, it's not, in India, the wild is never the wild. The wild has always got people interspersed with it. And once I started understanding the lives of the people living in those areas, living near those forests, what they did, how they survived, their knowledge base, it was incredible. And my entire worldview shifted in those 3 years that I spent with them. And I became very passionately involved in looking at the human side of conservation and not just I still adore being in the wild. I still like going out in the wild. I still enjoy nature. But very much focused on how do nature and people interact with each other. And especially in India, The future is going to look at how people and nature live together. And we've got to find those solutions. So I'm very much in that space. And I believe that I don't know whether that's true or not. I don't know if I was a man, I would have been different. But I do believe that my empathy and my relationship with women in the community shaped my worldview in a big way. Yeah.
Great. Dr. Solomon, in your experience, how do you think the role of women in conservation evolved over the years? And what strides do you hope to see in the future? Do you think we have evolved in the role of conservation in the field, or in the field and outside the field as well?
Sure. Yeah. It's definitely, well, let's be clear about one thing. Like, women have always been working in conservation, right? Like, that's part and parcel of being a woman, I think. Women have always been concerned, for example, about access to resources, right? This is just something that's really common. And of course, some of this is contextual, depending on where you are, what those resources are. But in general, we could say that people have been working in this space for a really, really long time, and women in particular. One of the intersecting identities common to women is caregiving roles. Sustaining and providing sustenance has often depended on conservation. But I do think positional leadership in organizations and agencies has been one of the roles that has been changing over the last few decades. We've seen that. We still have a very, very long way to go globally. And some places it's better than others. I work in the country of Belize and Central America, and most of the conservation organizations there are run by women. They're led by women. But in other places I work, that's not the case. It's typically much more male-dominated, the field. But there's been so much movement in the past decades, so I always share with students, I'm really, really hopeful. We have more women in positional roles than ever before. For example, Jennifer Morris is at the helm of the Nature Conservancy. It's one of the largest, if not the largest, conservation organization in the world. And then in the United States here, where I am, we finally have an Indigenous woman as a cabinet secretary leading the, Deb Haaland leads the Department of the Interior, which oversees agencies such as our National Park Service. But at the same time, we still have some real worrying and concerning constants, such as gender-based violence, which is violence towards a person because of that person's gender, or violence that affects people of a particular gender disproportionately. So obviously, these things all hamper our efforts in conservation. For example, they really hamper our efforts to address climate change. And a lot of this has to do with gender inequality and unequal power dynamics. So these things are still really concerning. We still have lots of issues of harassment in conservation NGOs and agencies. How do we keep fantastic women like all of you employed in places that have these types of issues? And while in some places there have been improvements, in others it's been really slow or even none. Like in some cases there's no improvement, right? And then women of color, especially face challenging workplaces. So providing very, very supportive environments for people to flourish has proven to be really difficult. And even for a discipline that's focused more recently on social injustices. But there's so many things that we can do here. In the U.S., one of the things that we should have access, everybody should have access to paid family leave, right? But in the United States, it's uneven, it's inequitable. We're one of 6 nations with no national paid leave. It's just startling. It's one of 7 nations with no national paid maternity leave. How do we expect women to flourish in their conservation careers in places where there's little support for the work that they do? So if I had my wish, our societies would be one where equity was paramount. How do we get there? I think that's the question, right? How do we get there? There's so much work to be done. We need to start working on it. And there's a lot of people who are working on it, but there's just so much to be done. A lot of times the work that we see is really almost forced due to incidences, or what I term disasters, where something like harassment was allowed to become an acceptable part of the workplace, and it festered and it flourished for various reasons. I would like to see all workplaces, even those that are great places to work, start to dig into those details. Like, do they do salary analyses? Do they bring in outside evaluators? Do they do gender analysis within their workplace, not just maybe in the conservation space? We have to build trust within the ranks. We have to be transparent about decision making and allow for unpopular ideas to be expressed freely and without retribution. So there's so much work to be done in this space. And I think we all need to be part of it. Every single person in an organization needs to be part of this type of work. I could say a lot more. I'm not going to go there.
Yeah. So since you mentioned that we, like women, face such challenges, obstacles in various organizations, and not just in conservation, but many organizations in every field. So do you remember any of the unique challenges that hampered your efforts when you started your career in wildlife?
Oh, yeah. I mean, just even for me, and just being perfectly honest, I think at one point I thought my career in academia was going to take a different turn than the one that I intended to have, right? I was working in East Africa, in Uganda, when I became pregnant with my first child. And I remember having a job interview. I moved to the Pacific, and I had a job interview at a university, and I didn't go because I couldn't fly because I was so pregnant. They wouldn't allow me on the plane. And it took a long time after that to get another interview. I was finishing my dissertation at that time. I had a young child, and it was really other women who encouraged me, keep going, keep getting it done, write the dissertation. This is hard, but they were supporting me because it was something that I wanted to do. But I really, at one time, thought, this is not going to happen. I'm going to have to do something totally different. So I've had lots of challenges like that. And in the field, I've had some incidences where being a woman was an advantage, but at the same time, there were other obstacles. I remember being in the field near a national park, and it was late at night, and somebody was very angry, probably had drank a little too much, and they were outside my door, throwing condoms under my door, and banging on my wall to get in. And it's pretty scary when that happens. I've had similar incidences where there's been weapons as well involved. So you need to surround yourself with people that support you, and safety is really paramount for a lot of women working in this space. It's really important that we make these places as safe as possible for all people working in them.
Yeah. These challenges may sound very stupid to people, like being a woman, we are talking about these things, but they do affect our mental health in so many ways that it acts like a hindrance in our conservation careers, not just in conservation, in our careers and professions. So they do make a lot of difference if we don't go through these kind of things. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. I would like to know from Dr. Worah now that as a leader who has been involved in various conservation programs, both on and off the field, how do you balance your professional responsibilities and other aspects of your life?
So, balance is probably the wrong word because it's hard to find that. I think it's very different in different contexts, and I recall that when I first started and as I said, the career came up on me. It wasn't me who chose the career almost chose me. And in those days, the challenges, I was a bit oblivious, I should say, to some of those challenges, but the the people who faced the brunt of it were my parents, surprisingly, because in an Indian context, the parents are supposed to guide the children. The parents are supposed to decide for the children what they will study, whether they'll become a doctor or whether they'll become an engineer. And it was very fixed in those days, that if you're a smart woman, if you're doing well in your studies, then you're probably going to go for medical studies. And I kind of rebelled against that and said, no, I don't want to be a doctor. I want to be a vet. And those were the early days when we all had dreams of being a vet or being something else. But I underestimated how much pressure my parents must have felt from all their relatives who kind of accused them of letting their daughter go astray, not caring what she was doing. What on earth is she doing? Sitting in the jungle for days on end, driving a Jeep by herself, having all these people, sharing a tent with men. I mean, these were all the kinds of things that, the pressures that they faced. And I didn't realize that they were going through all this until much later. But until I also remember one time when I was in the field and I was sitting in some remote forest rest house somewhere and looking at a map and trying to collate some data. And this bunch of young men passed through on a picnic or something. And they sat and chatted with me, tried to find out what I was doing. I tried to explain to the best of my ability. Of course, they didn't understand at all what I was doing. But then before leaving, they looked at me and they said, you know what? Your parents must really not love you at all. And I was like, what? It's actually the opposite. My parents love me very much, which is why they let me do what I'm doing. But in an Indian context, it was really that only crazy women would do this, or women who have no support system will do this, or women who have nowhere else to turn will do this. We weren't really taken seriously in that sense. Of course, we were taken seriously by our peers. But remember, a vast majority of people out there are people who don't really understand what you're doing. And so we had to kind of fight. I think we had to fight ignorance more than prejudice. It was really ignorance. People didn't know what this was, that there was actually a career in forestry and wildlife, stuff like that. So that was tough, that period. Then, of course, as you get older and as I started traveling and working in different countries and different cultures, I realized that everyone's going through similar experiences, right? It might be slightly different somewhere, it might be slightly different somewhere, but we're all going through fairly similar experiences. I also recognize that being a woman is in some cases a handicap, but being an older woman is not necessarily a handicap. So I, fortunately or unfortunately, I started going gray at a very early age. In my late 30s or early 40s, I started going gray. And I realized, everybody around me, all my peers and all my friends were like, you must color your hair. You can't be gray at this age. And I was like, actually, it's a huge advantage in my career. Suddenly, everybody was taking me seriously. Suddenly, everything I said was added touch of gravitas in what I said, because I was this statesman-like person who was telling them what to do. So I think what you learn as you go along is you learn to balance all these different nuances of how do you actually get the best of, how do you actually make the most of what's been given to you. So there are disadvantages, but there are also advantages. You just need to figure out the best balance of how to manage all these different aspects of your life. And certainly it is a demanding career. There's no question about it. It's very demanding, and you have to make a choice. You have to decide, how much you're going to let it take over versus how much you're going to try and balance your work and life between this. But I have to say one thing is often people wonder. So I've gone through a kind of a medical issue, and I've had a long treatment. And my doctor was releasing me yesterday, and he basically said, "Go away and go on a holiday. Just take a break, get out." So me being me, typically, I said, "Yeah, we have projects in all these fantastic places all over India. So I'm going to go visit all these projects and all these amazing places." He took one look at me and he says, "No, I'm not going to allow you to go and visit any project because it's not about, because then you just start working again." But that's how we are, that's how we are conditioned. And I think that's one of the beauties of it, right? Because we're the lucky ones whose career, whose profession, whose livelihood is the same as one's passion, everything that I always wanted to do if I was not working is what I do when I'm working. the same places that I visit. I get to go to amazing places. I get to meet incredible people. I get to interact with communities and cultures from all over the world. I mean, what else would you want? What other career would you want? So while it's very demanding, it's also a dream come true, at least for me, to think that there's nothing else I'd rather do in this whole wide world. Nothing. So I'm fortunate in that sense.
That's so great to hear, because since you mentioned that in an Indian context, it's really difficult to convince your parents if you wish to pursue this as a career. Now it has become a little easy in some way, but I think I'm very lucky in this way, because my parents used to handle me a Jungle magazine when I was like 10 years old. So they were the ones who pushed me towards this direction. So I think I'm pretty blessed in this case.
It's very true, for in the Indian context, it's all the women that I work with in my organization as well. The first hurdle is the parents. And if you have that support, then everything becomes so much easier after that, with the parental support. But without the parental support, I really admire those women, who kind of made it despite those odds. Yeah.
This is so true. Dr. Solomon, can you speak to the importance of gender diversity and inclusion in conservation efforts, and how it contributes to more effective and sustainable outcomes in conservation organizations or forest departments or any wildlife institution or community movements as well?
Yeah, sure. Well, there's been a lot of academic literature on this topic. A lot of the work more recently has really come from other fields like business, here in the US and elsewhere as well. The field of technology right now has been having a lot of discussions around women in technology. So in terms of conservation, in general, we find that countries with higher levels of gender inequality, those tend to have lower environmental well-being and vice versa, or higher levels of inequality tend to have lower environmental well-being and vice versa. There's been studies, for example, in India and Nepal. One study in particular found that forest conditions are better with a higher proportion of women in key decision-making roles. So you see a lot of work like that. It's one of the issues with some of the studies, I have to say, especially out of some of the other fields, is that this tends to be, it's not causal. There are associations, right? So you have a lot of women, you get more of this, but it doesn't necessarily show causality, which can be problematic, right? But I just want to point that out. Importantly, though, I think one of the most important things to keep in mind is that this is not just a numbers game. Like add women and stir, that doesn't work, right? We need to have, women have to have agency to make decisions. And in general, more diversity typically is positive in conservation. We need a diversity of ways of thinking. We need diverse actors to come up with innovative solutions, especially now with the challenges that we're facing. And there's been a lot of positive associations found in other fields where more women is associated with more, or innovation. It's associated with innovation. So yeah, I mean, we know this from research in other fields. We know it from some research in conservation as well, that it's really important to have diversity of thought and diversity of people involved in the conservation equation to find solutions to the problems that we're facing.
So how do you navigate and address gender biases and stereotypes within the organizations? What strategies we can employ to advocate for gender equality in organizations, for women's empowerment and more inclusion?
That's a really big question. Maybe both of us could chime in on it. I'll add a few things and let's see where the conversation goes. There's lots of different strategies. And I think one of the important things to remember is that a lot of this has to do with culture. And so wherever you're working in the world, you really do have to understand the culture within, and culture's generally nested, right? You might have culture from a societal perspective, but if you're working in a conservation organization, there's also culture within the organization. And so it's important, first of all, to just understand that some of these things are not going to be very visible at first. And so one of the main things that I would say is that you need to have leaders who buy in to the fact that diversity, gender biases exist, that they exist, and they are impacting the workplace, and they're impacting your conservation programs. And so leadership is really critical. It's one of those critical ingredients. Or from leaders in the organization, it's really hard to get buy-in from other people. I'm just going to give some space, and does somebody else want to chime in as well?
I can ask Dr. Worah also, like, how do you think, what can we add on in the organizations or the recruitment process or the inclusion that may promote gender equality?
Yeah, so this is as Jennifer mentioned, the culture around this is at multiple levels. It's the culture of your society, it's the culture within your family, it's the culture within your organization. All of this is going to play out in some way or the other in the way gender roles play out. So as an organization, I must say that we're lucky, at least within WWF in India, that we have women in multiple leadership positions. So it's not that we have a great male-female ratio and then all the women are in lower level positions. No, we've got most of our leadership positions are women. WWF International for the first time has a women DG, so that's really good as well. And that's the first step, right? If you have women in leadership positions, they're going to then be the role models. And they are going to be the drivers of a lot of the change that you want to see in the organization. So it was really great today, because before we had this session in the morning, we had a session with the women in our organization, just basically celebrating each other. We weren't even, and we didn't exclude the men from this. We very much invited them as well to be part of it. But the purpose was to celebrate each other, to support each other, to motivate each other, and also in a way. This idea of that collectively we can achieve a lot more as well. So rather than being isolated and letting ourselves be isolated, if we act collectively, if we bond more, if we talk to each other more, if we understand each other more, sometimes women are women's worst enemies. And that comes when you don't understand each other and you don't communicate. So one of the things in the organization that's really important is to ensure that there is this positive energy that's emanating from our staff. And it's not just the women, right? It's men and women. It's how men support women. There are going to be individuals in every organization who are toxic. Let's just face it. And really, in an organization, it's imperative. There's a responsibility that this should not be allowed to flourish, and they should be nipped in the bud. So if we do know that, from a gender perspective, there are individuals who are creating a problem, we need to act on it and not let it fester. So there are, there's a whole lot of. It also depends on your HR, your human resources department, and how proactive they are and how much they understand these issues. And the head of our HR department is a woman, so she gets it. And we have long conversations about how are we going to empower, how are we going to energize, how are we going to recruit. So it's a constant communication, it's a constant conversation, and it's a constant battle, I should say. One of the things that we've found lately, and there's a lot of women on this call, and I wonder what their experience is. I'm somehow finding that there's less women working in the field in conservation than there used to be, maybe 10, 15 years ago. And I don't know why. Maybe it's just us. And our field locations are too remote, but that should not be the reason, because we've all worked in remote conditions. But there's fewer women, and there's a higher turnover. So women are coming in to work in conservation, coming to the field, but leaving fairly quickly for other careers, other jobs. And it's a bit worrying. So we have been noticing this trend, and we've been talking to each other in the organization to say, is this common? Is this a common trend? Is it happening in other conservation organizations? Is it just us? And I think that as conservation organizations, we need to have a conversation about this. If it is real, then we need to address it, because obviously there's something that's not right, that's not working for women in the field, maybe. I'll stop here.
Thank you for such an honest and beautiful answer. I really appreciate that. I just want to add up on this, that even if the participation rate is higher in conservation, the sustenance rate is quite difficult in some way or the other, with everybody having their own reasons and challenges. So I think why women are they're participating and not sustaining, that should also be considered and look up to.
Yeah.
Also, just to lighten up the mood, I just want to ask if you have some memorable moment of your experience in this long career in wildlife, which whenever you think of jungle or forest, that just clicks on your head and it just makes you happy.
Yeah. So I'll tell you one positive and one very intense learning experience that I had, which has stayed with me till today. I'll start with that, and it really is related to gender roles and how little we understand them sometimes. So when I first started my career in the field, as I said, I was living in the village, in the community, and I was very what shall I say? What's the word? Anyway, I was great. I was a great activist in terms of women's rights and women's empowerment, and how we are at that age. I was in my late 20s, and all fired up to look at all these women who seemed so oppressed, and I'm going to liberate all these women. I'm going to bring in my great ideas, and we're going to create these women's groups, and we're going to do all this fantastic stuff. Anyway, so here I was, doing all my stuff and getting the women organized, and we were meeting in the evenings, and we were excited, and we were empowered, and all the great stuff. And people who worked with women in the field know how exciting it can be and how liberating it can be when you're sitting with them, and they're suddenly seeing things that they've never seen before, and they're all excited. So anyway, here we were, and all this was going on. And then one fine day, I came back from the field, and one of the brightest and the smartest women, with a very supportive husband, she came up to me, and she was crying, and I looked at her face, and she was all bruised, and she'd been beaten. So I immediately asked her, and I said, what's happened and what's going on? So she said that my husband beat me up yesterday evening. And I said, for what reason? And she said, I don't know. I wasn't home when he came back from the field. And when I came home from the meeting, they'd had a community meeting. When I came home from the meeting, he beat me. He called me was drunk, and he beat me up. So I immediately went to the husband, because I knew him well as well. And I said, what's going on? You've been supportive all this time, and why have you done this? So he then explained to me, and he says, look, obviously it's a mistake, and I'm really sorry, and I'm really apologetic, and it'll never happen again. But think of my situation. I left home at 4 a.m. To go and work in the field. I barely ate anything. I had a small packed lunch of dry chapatis and chilies, which I ate in the afternoon. I worked all day physically. I came home dog-tired and hungry at around 7 o'clock in the evening, and there was nobody home. The hearth was cold. There was no food in the house. And all I had to do was drink. So I drank, I got drunk, and when she came home, I was so upset that I beat her. But the reason for it was that, I just, this is it. This is my life. And I realized then that, while we are bringing our values and our cultures and our ideas to people in very different contexts, we also need to be very conscious of the bigger picture. Don't lose sight of the big picture in the focus that you have in terms of your agenda. And my agenda was women's empowerment, and I had lost focus, and I had lost sight of what was going on in their lives and in the lives of their families around there. So that was a big lesson for me, which has stayed with me throughout. And now whenever I work with women, it's something that I always make sure that, that I don't lose the big picture, and that I'm working with the whole family, and I'm not just working with the women. That was one. The other, of course, in terms of a more lighter note, I think some of the best times that we had are gone by, and some of the stuff that we used to do when we were young, in WWF and people who are young won't understand this, but we used to run these nature camps. And these were camps where young kids would come and spend a week in the wilderness. And we would be, teaching them about nature. So just nature education, how to handle snakes, how to run from an NFL, I don't know, all kinds of crazy stuff. And I think these were the most formative years of the lives of not just us who ran the camps and the volunteers who worked with us, but also those kids who came and immersed themselves in nature for a week. I mean, it was just pure immersion. We were in the middle of the forest, living in tents. We had snake bags hanging on each tent. We had, elephants coming at night in the camp. We had leopards coming and stalking us. There was all kind, and we were, I wouldn't say we were hugely experienced. We were 22, 23 years old. We had kids who were 12, 13 years old in our charge. But those days, and that is what made us into not just conservationists, but we were naturalists. We understood and were in tune with nature. And that is something that I feel is missing, even in conservation of today, because it's become very tech-driven. It's become, very, very driven by lots of things which are remote. The look, the feel, the art of being in the forest, being in nature, being one with the people and the wildlife, living for 3 or 4 years in a community. I don't see the young conservationists of today doing that. And if they do, that's fantastic, because that is what shapes you. Not the going in and out and using, technology to understand everything and all of that, but really, really getting in there and understanding what makes it tick. And in India, we're going to need this. We're going to need understanding of nature and people and the interaction between nature and people much, much more as we go ahead. Because there's going to be more people, there's going to be more infrastructure, there's going to be more development. And if we want all of this to happen and not lose whatever wilderness and wildlife that we have left, then we've got to be much more tuned in to how we're going to make this coexistence between people and nature work in the future. And that's my dream. And that's, I think, the challenge that everybody on this call, especially the people who are in their careers of conservation, you're going to face this. You're going to face this. How do we find the balance? Yeah.
Well, that's a great answer. So I think first thing when you think of wildlife, forest, nature, and before going or pursuing it as a career, the one thing that should we keep in mind or we should think of is connection. If the connection is there with people and wildlife and animals, certainly there will be a long journey in the field of it. So I'll wrap up the session by asking one last question. So with my own experiences in the field over the past couple of years, I'm certainly well aware of how demanding and challenging it can be to work in the conservation field. And since both of you have worked in different landscapes throughout your career, Dr. Solomon, what advice would you give to young girls who step into this career? Do you have any suggestions on how one should take care of one's health and safety in the field?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing is to make sure you have support, right? Because a lot of things that we've talked about today are just really hard, right? I think most people, unfortunately, will see gender-based violence in their careers in conservation if they stay here long enough. So having a really great support system is important, to whether they're friends or family, somebody you can go to and talk to about the things that you're feeling, the things that you're seeing, the challenges you're facing, and somebody, importantly, to celebrate things with as well. You have to celebrate everything good that comes your way. Every little step of the way, you should be celebrating as well. So that's probably my main advice, is to find a great support system and use that support system throughout your career. It's really important for your own well-being, both physical and mental well-being.
Wow.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, actually. I think I would have given a very similar answer. And when I was in the field and doing my field work, I had a support system, and I had a very unique support system. I must be the only person who had a Maharaja as my support system. So basically, when I was out there in the field, there were days, after months of being in the field, there were days when I just desperately wanted to speak to somebody in English. I just said, I need to just go somewhere where I can talk in English to somebody. And there was this Maharaja who lived in this old, he lived in this 300-room palace by himself. And I would go and drive some 60 kilometers, go see him, because I knew that A, I could talk in English, and B, I would get pudding for dessert. Because every time I came, he would say, "Oh, you've come, I'm going to make pudding." So that was my support system. I had somebody to go to when I knew that I would get really lonely or I would get really, stressed. But more than that, my support system, and I would say this to all young girls who are starting off their careers in conservation, is look for a local family. Look for a local family who will become yours and who will support you and whom you can go to and whom you can be with. Because there's nothing like that. Till today, 35 years later, the family that I lived with when I was in the field are still in touch with me. I still visit them. I just got a call from him saying, "Please come and stay with us in the forest. You'll recover really fast. We're looking forward to having you here." So they've become my extended family almost. And I think that's what you should do is when you go out to the field, look for somebody whom you can, who will be your close support system. And then things will become much easier after that. It doesn't need to be somebody very hi-fi fancy. Just, find a local family. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I do agree with that. Thank you for sharing that. I think we'll now look for some questions in the chat box. Well, yeah, so there's a question for Jen. Considering the concept of intersectionality and acknowledging the agency of women, do you believe that merely increasing women's representation in leadership roles within wildlife conservation is necessary, but not sufficient for their empowerment?
So the question was if increasing just the numbers of people in women leadership is not sufficient, or I couldn't hear everything.
It says, do you believe that merely increasing women's representation in leadership roles within conservation is necessary, but not sufficient for their empowerment?
That's it's a great question. I like how it's phrased. I think it goes back to, some of the work that needs to be done is at a grander level than just within an organization. So, I think I mentioned have women at start, not enough. Some of this we're talking about cultural change, and you could change culture within an organization, but the overarching umbrella would be society, and that's much more difficult to change. And in some cases, it might not be going in the direction that we want it to. So is it sufficient to just have representation? Representation has to have agency. Even if there are women there, we're going to make sure that they're supported and that they have agency to make those decisions. So I wish I could say it was as easy as just adding some women, making sure they have agency within an organization, but there's greater challenges as well.
Thank you for answering that. Dr. Worah, would you like to answer the next question? Yeah. It says, how do patriarchal societal structures continue to shape the experiences and opportunities of women leaders in the field? And what strategies can be employed to address these underlying systematic challenges?
This goes back to what Jennifer just said, is, the largest societal change. We're talking about embedded values, embedded cultures, much larger change in society. And that's not going to come fast. And that's not going to come from one organization or a bunch of people trying to do things differently. But, it's incremental. It adds up. And the more we challenge those norms, the more we are able to bend some of them, the more we are able to work around them. Because, one of the things that and this is also the experience that I had and the example that I gave you, is trying to make things happen very fast. Trying to make things happen when people are not ready for it can actually have a backlash, can actually have the opposite reaction. So I think we've got to accept the fact that we are locked into the system to some extent. It's not great, but how do we then find those ways and means to challenge it in a way that doesn't make life more difficult for women? Let's just make sure that by doing this, you may be making your life easier, but what is it doing to women around you? And this is why I keep saying, look at the larger picture, look at society, look at, what's going on around you, and make those incremental changes. And those small things will add up. It sometimes feels like it's very small. A small battle won, a small challenge overcome, but they do add up. And I celebrate those, and one of the things that is that celebrate every small victory, because each one of those adds up to the larger change that we're looking for.
There is another question for you, Dr. Worah. As a women scientist in wildlife conservation, have you observed any disparities in access to resources, funding, or career advancement opportunities between genders?
The unfortunate wisdom, but what I'm going to give you is no. I get asked this a lot, to say, as a woman, what did you face? Did they withhold your funding? Did they make life more difficult for you? Did they refuse to give you a vehicle because you don't know how to drive? All of those kinds of things are asked. But frankly speaking, I don't think I faced any hurdles as a women researcher in conservation. And part of it may have been the novelty, because there were so few of us in those days. There were hardly any women. So in fact, when I would walk into the room, and I remember walking into the Ministry of Environment. Dr. Ranjit Singh was the secretary at that time. And I pitched my project to him. I wanted to go and look for this lesser cat in the Dang forest. And I wanted a jeep from him. I wanted the ministry to give me a jeep. And I went up to him and I said, this is what I need from you. And I need a vehicle, because without a vehicle, I can't do this work. And he just immediately agreed. And I feel it's partly, how many women had walked into his office in the ministry and said, I want to go off and do this kind of research on this unknown at that time. Now, of course, it's very widely known. At that time, unknown cat. So I do believe that actually there may have been some advantages rather than disadvantages.
Yeah, great. That's a great answer. Thank you, Arsalan, for asking such amazing questions. There is one more question for Jen. Aishwarya is asking that who is that one woman, if you have to pick, inspires you the most in your personal life?
Oh, that's such a hard question to just pick one woman. I'll put a group. I'll instead select a group. I think the most inspiring group for me right now are students that I work with. I work with this fabulous group of students who are dedicating their lives to conservation, and they inspire me every single day. They are the future. They are amazing, and they are going to persevere and do wonderful things. I could see them doing wonderful things right now. So those are the people who really are inspiring me today.
That's really beautiful. Yeah, thank you for asking such amazing questions. It was really fun. I think we shall end the session. It was really great to have you guys. And I think I would have gone a lot, but we had time constraints, so we can end it here. And so thank you, Dr. Worah and Dr. Solomon, for sharing your inspiring stories and insights today. Your contributions have enriched our understanding and the people on the call, their understanding of women's role in conservation. And to the audience, thank you for joining us in celebrating women in the wild. So let's continue to support and empower women in conservation efforts, not just in conservation, in every field. Let's just celebrate women today, every day. Thank you for joining, and happy International Women's Day.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Allow me to introduce Center for Wildlife Studies to all of you. Center for Wildlife Studies is a 40-year-old non-profit organization specializing in wildlife research, conservation, policy, and education. Until 2020, we used to host public talks on the latest topics in wildlife conservation and research in our Bangalore office. But due to pandemic, we have instead been conducting a series of webinars online. So far, our webinars have covered a wide range of industry topics, and such as public health and zoonotic diseases, tigers, snake bites, elephants, and bioacoustics. So you can visit our YouTube channel if you wish to view our previous webinars. And today's webinar will also be recorded and available on YouTube.